all. Joining me now is Marian Wright Edelman, founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund. Bob Herbert, senior fellow at Demos, Shelby Knox, a feminist organizer, and Lawrence Otis Graham, historian, lawyer, and author of Our Kind of People, Inside the Black Upper Class. Thank you all for being here.
Good to be here.
So, Bob, why does Mitt Romney hate Big Bird?
Well, you know, the GOP is going to do to Big Bird what they've already done to the middle class, man. They're just going to get rid of it. So it's all about, you know, if Big Bird had more money, if Big Bird was wealthier, it would be protected, but that's not the case.
Well, specifically if Big Bird were privatized, right? So Ms. Edelman, we know what happens when children's programming has advertisers, right? We know what kinds of things will be advertised to children. One of the things I love about PBS is the fact that my daughter, who's 10, didn't, as a 2- and 3-year-old, see cereal commercials, didn't see toy commercials, didn't get revved up about what the next big gift was, because, well, when you watch PBS, it's a safe space. Is this in part about taking away that kind of safe space for kids?
Which is so limited today, that safe space, as you've indicated, and children are a big commercial market, and they spend billions trying to get them addicted to certain brands. I remember going in the store with my children and walking down the aisle of the grocery store, and they would lobby me about Cheerios. I said, why am I sitting here arguing with a 2-year-old? And I realized that they are treated as a consumer market, and so children are very big business. They should keep their hands off of Big Bird and Sesame Street.
They were lobbying you about cereal. I mean, that might be good.
They wanted the brand. They were, I want these sweet Cheerios. I said, I'm not going to argue with my 2-year-old about that.
It's not just the children's programming, because they would be able to get advertising for Sesame Street.
Yep.
The reason you have public broadcasting is for all of those programs that get advertising. So, you know, there are arts programs, there are education programs, there are issues, philosophical issues that you might want to explore that you would never be able to get corporate support for. And PBS is an outlet for that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, Shelby, it feels like this point that Bob's making here is precisely this kind of larger battle that's going on right now between Democrats and Republicans about needing to make a claim that there are some sets of things that are public goods, that are actually not up for sponsorship or for privatization.
You know, one of the things about PBS is that when you look at a show like Sesame Street, you see diverse families, you see children who are proud of themselves, who are being taught to value their education. When you privatize children's programming, you're not only talking about advertising, but the programming actually has to fit the advertisers. So you're looking at shows like some on Nickelodeon or Disney where you see young women who are incredibly thin because the beauty industry wants them to buy their products later. You see kids who want all of the latest electronics instead of are excited about going to school. So you're making future consumers not just through the advertisers, but if PBS were to have advertisements, you would have companies invested in the programming to make sure our future consumers are doing what they want.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's not that my kid didn't want a Tickle Me Elmo at one point when Tickle Me Elmo was the big deal, but she doesn't want to look like Elmo. Like, Elmo is not aspirational. So, Lawrence, I actually wanted to ask you about that aspirational aspect, because it feels to me, you know, so much of your work, particularly around the black middle class and upper class, has been about this notion of the middle class as aspirational. I wanted to listen real quickly to our vice president, who was making a very, actually, I'm sorry, not listen to him. I'll just tell you what the vice president was saying here. When he was discussing the middle class, he actually defines it as aspirational, saying that middle class families aspire to home ownership, a car, college, education for their children, health and retirement security, and occasional family vacations. That's actually the U.S. Department of Commerce and Vice President Biden saying this is what the middle class is. The story I just told is that Sesame Street is our aspirational middle class. It's what we want. It's the kind of community we wish we lived in. Is that what's dying in our current economic circumstances?
That is what's dying, Melissa. When I think about my 3 African-American children who look at shows on PBS, they see themselves, as Shelby pointed out, they see themselves reflected in those shows, in those programs, and they say, that's me, that's who I am. And my kids were so excited when Michelle Obama appeared on Sesame Street, and here she was telling them, you know, how to grow good foods that you can eat, and they felt that could be me one day. And we don't see that in commercial television that's aimed at young people, because their goal is not to show the diversity of children that are out there. Their goal is to figure out cross-promotional programs, to figure out a way to launch this particular singing star on this TV show so that they will be able to go on parade around the country to sell what they're selling.
Right, Sesame Street's had the multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilinguistic demographic
for 30 years.
Since the 70s. Coming up, we're going to talk more about this question of the middle class, but specifically, it has been a baneful week for Mitt Romney. The politics of the middle class is about more than policy. Really, it needs to be personal. Candidates search for their own storylines that connect them with the average Joe, which for Mitt Romney can be a bit of a struggle. No judgment here. It's just that his personal roots simply were not sown in the salt of the earth. And when he himself became an even richer man, largely through his work at Bain Capital, and that work has dogged the governor all week. It began with a major story out of the Boston Globe questioning what year Mitt Romney actually severed his ties with Bain Capital, and the questions kept coming. Not even the Condi for VP floater could stem the tide. So last night, Governor Romney granted a series of interviews to address this issue.
In February of 1999, I left Bain Capital and left all management authority and responsibility for the firm. I had no ongoing activity or involvement in the affairs of Bain Capital.
So, see, no matter the explanation, the question remains, will Romney's upper crust biography bar his way to connecting with middle-class voters, the Sesame demographic? With me at the table, Marian Wright Edelman, children's rights activist Bob Herbert of Demos, feminist activist Shelby Knox, and Lawrence Otis Graham, lawyer and historian. Okay, I don't think that just because you're rich, it means you cannot connect, but I gotta say, the fact that we can't know clearly when he's working, when he's not working, whether or not he's going to release the taxes, is the bar. Will middle-class voters look at Mitt Romney and say, okay, yes, this guy understands my pain?
That's not happening already. I mean, I think you see it reflected in the polls. They see this guy as kind of a distant figure. He's the epitome of the 1%, actually 1/10 of 1%, maybe. But I think the biggest, and I think that that's actually Romney's biggest problem, because the Republicans would have an opening in this economic environment ordinarily. But people remember those Bush years, and they remember what happened to the economy. They don't blame Obama for the state of the economy. They recognize what he inherited, and it's very easy to associate Romney with that era.
Well, especially if he's floating Condi Rice as his VP.
He does nothing to dissociate himself from that, and I think that that's a fundamental mistake.
So let me talk about the taxes piece a little bit, because the big conversation is that President Obama wants to extend the Bush tax cuts. I've been wondering if this is sort of a language and attempt to in fact push President Obama and George Bush together. But I wanted to correct just like one piece of misinformation. The way that so much media has been reporting this is the idea that President Obama is willing to raise taxes on every household that makes over $250,000, which is not quite right. I just sort of want to say this, right? The first $250,000 of everyone's income is safe, if you will, and it's only the marginal proportion over. So if you make $300,000, it's only on that $50,000 over. Is there a way in which $250,000, when people say that, for what part of the world does that feel like middle class? Living in Louisiana, that feels like rich folks.
I think there is a part of the world where, part of this country where it does feel like middle class, but it's a very small part of the country, and
San
actually
Francisco,
we're
New York.
in it.
Yeah. In fact, Sesame Street is in it, right? Right, New City.
Most Americans do not think that a family making $250,000 a year is middle class. They believe that you've gone beyond the middle class when you get there.
And Melissa, also, when you look at certain communities, cities that formerly had historically been rather successful, places like Memphis. My parents are both from Memphis, Tennessee, where there was a thriving middle class there. My grandfather had a successful trucking company and had restaurants. And you look at those communities now, the black communities, particularly in those cities, are completely decimated. Yes. My wife is from Detroit, same situation there. Mitt Romney is from another Detroit. He's from the Grosse Points, you know, from the exclusive private schools. He talks about identifying with the middle class, but here was a man whose father ran a major auto manufacturing company, and his father was also of clearly a presidential candidate who was more forthcoming and better able to connect with the middle class than his own son.
Yeah, and more pro-civil rights, right?
Absolutely.
Sort of openly.
Able to talk about this as opposed to using the NAACP, as Mitt Romney did, as a prop in a narrative that was completely false, and also was a way in which to throw black folks under the bus to galvanize his own audience, and that's what he's done to try to go after the quote-unquote white middle class by throwing black folks
Right. This is the Nancy Pelosi claim that the NAACP talk was a prop to get the boos, because getting booed by black folks is good for shoring up a base.
Absolutely. You get those Tea Partiers by getting people it's his Sister Souljah moment. That was what his moment was, to sort of throw this group under the bus to say, look how strong and tough I am. I'll speak out against black folks who want free stuff, when in fact that's not what the African-American community is looking for.
Yeah, well, right, and even the notion that free stuff is actually never free, right? In fact, we pay for it with these taxes. The idea that we are not our government, there's this government is giving us stuff, we're taxpayers.
Well, we are taxpayers, but I also think it's Mitt Romney who opposed the bailout of GM, which would have destroyed a whole lot of the middle class in Michigan. But more importantly, I think he's endorsed the Paul Ryan budget, which is the most devastatingly irresponsible budget and unjust budget. I mean, they're proposing to not only continue the Bush tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, over 125 each, but to give them another $265,000 in tax cuts. The top 1% does not need more tax cuts, and I just think this is the most hypocritical effort to talk about being concerned with the budget deficit while you're going to just hand away trillions more.
Yeah, in fact, let's just look at the picture of that, because there is this different, as much as this sort of President Obama wants to extend the Bush tax cuts, I mean, the fact is the difference between what the GOP's plan is and what President Obama's plan is just so clear on this graph that if budgets are moral documents, if our tax policy is an ethical document, these are the ethics, right? This is who the GOP thinks deserves a break in this country today. Up next, we're going to talk a bit about President Obama's special Sherpa to the middle class. What is his...
And then I think about Michelle's family. You know, her dad, he was a blue-collar worker, worked at the water filtration plant in Chicago. And Michelle's mom, she stayed at home and looked after Michelle and her brother until they got older, and then worked as a secretary most of her life. And yet, despite these modest beginnings, Michelle and her brother Craig could go to the best schools on earth and rise up to do extraordinary things.
That was the president telling the First Lady's middle-class story, in part to connect with middle-income voting base that he's currently courting. While Michelle Obama's family, the Robinsons, and the Robinson family history may be helpful politically, the fact is it really is, these days, almost more of a fairy tale. For the average middle-class family, take-home income has dropped 7% in the past 10 years. And if you're part of an African-American family, your household wealth dropped off the cliff, plunging by 53% between 2005 and 2009. That middle-class Michelle story of yesteryear is just that, a story of yesteryear, far more challenging today. And with me at the table, Marian Wright Edelman, Bob Herbert, Shelby Knox, and Lawrence Otis Graham. Shelby, that kind of yesteryear story, does that mean what does that mean for young people in your generation?
You know, you used to could count on aspirational votes, talking about the 250,000. My generation doesn't even think that we're going to make $250,000 a year. Fewer young people are homeowners. We're renting, we're moving back in with our parents. So the idea of a middle class, I'm sad to say, is not really one that we have. Now, when President Obama is talking about Michelle Obama, what we've got over here is that 42% of American women don't have enough income to meet basic household expenses.
Right.
That goes up to 66% when you're talking about African American women. Right. We add the pay gap in there, 77% for women, 66 cents on the dollar for African American women. So if he can tell this story, and it's one that needs to be told, but he needs to be speaking to the reality of American young people, especially American young women. When we're devastated out there. together, and we know these challenges.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the sort of aspirational aspect in this idea that, like, when you look at those hard facts, it feels like this story of a government blue-collar worker, the stay-at-home mom, the kids that go to Princeton,
it doesn't exist anymore. And her story is a real story, despite the fact that Mitt Romney's trying to appropriate it for himself or to tell his own story.
Right.
But I went to Princeton and Harvard Law School with Michelle Robinson at that time, and she and Craig were down-to-earth, regular people who you knew were going to work hard in order to make that family back in Chicago proud of them. The thing about it is that we see so many of those successful families now not being able to repeat that with their own children. In my book, Our Kind of People, I got a lot of heat for this, talking about sort of this Jack and Jill, Lynx, Boulay crowd, this black elite crowd. But what's happening is there's a short moment in time, and we've had this black success as entrepreneurs and investment bankers and lawyers, but we're the first ones to get cut. And once we get cut, because we don't have that deep reservoir of networks and connections and old boy connections the way that George Bush had. George used to tell the story when he graduated from Yale with a C average that he could still become president. It's like, that can't happen.
Right. Only in certain bodies.
Absolutely.
That's right.
So there's a certain amount of white male privilege that goes along with, and that's not true for all white families, obviously, but for certain well-connected families like the Bushes, 3 generations of people that were in the Senate or high-level government officials, and a C-average white guy can get to Harvard Business School and then go on to become president.
Yeah, it's my favorite.
That doesn't happen in the black and brown community.
That's right. It's my favorite story of the Obamas is that they paid off their student loans moments before he took the oath of office for the U.S. Senate. And the idea, I mean, that to me is sort of what middle class feels like you were still burdened with student loans even as you were becoming a senator. Up next, we're going to talk more on this issue, but quite specifically, I've got some issues with governors who have flat out refused to implement the Affordable Care Act. How is the middle class this very minute? Most of the nation's governors are gathered together for a conference in Williamsburg, Virginia, where you can bet the hot hallway governor-to-governor chit-chat is something a bit like this. You gonna take it? I'm not going to take it. Are you going to take it? Me? No way. Me either. You see, so far, 7 governors, including my governor, Louisiana's Bobby Jindal, have flat out refused to implement the law, an option given to them in the Supreme Court's decision on the Affordable Care Act. 2 of those states, Texas and Florida, by themselves account for 3 million people who are eligible for coverage under the Medicaid expansion, who simply won't get it thanks to their governors. Now, the law could extend coverage to anyone with an income of up to 133% of the poverty line, and let's be clear who falls into that category. That's an individual with an annual income just below $15,000, or a family of 4 living on as little as $30,000 a year. Before the Affordable Care Act expanded the social safety net to catch these people, they simply were not quite poor enough to qualify for health care. And they still aren't in those 7 states whose governors seem content to let them continue to slip through the cracks. So as we are discussing the making of an appeal to the middle class, I still have to wonder why, for those who are still struggling to get in that class, their own governors would deny them just a little bit of help. Still with me at the table, Marian Wright Edelman, Bob Herbert, Shelby Knox, and Lawrence Otis Graham. It feels to me, Mrs. Edelman, like the 133% of the poverty line is a better definition of what is poor. The idea that we've ever thought of a family of 4 existing on $30,000 as wealthy enough to buy health insurance is just wrong.
Absolutely, and you know, millions, tens of millions of people have been health poor, and the ACA, the Affordable Health Care Act, is a major, major step forward. It's astonishing to me that any governor would think about turning down 100% federal funding and then 90% federal funding to help its people get one of the most basic human rights that there is. Texas has the largest number of uninsured children and uninsured people. Mississippi, Louisiana, all the others have drugged their feet in enforcing Medicaid for the poorest and chipped the children's health insurance for the program for the poorest. But there are millions of people who can get help, tens of millions, and the idea that governors are saying we're not going to help our people, stay out of more emergency rooms, stop suffering death and preventable illnesses is just astonishing. And I do hope that the voters in those states will really look and say, is this right leadership for us?
Well, and on exactly that question, on the issue of voters, Bob, I wanted to ask you about this. So Bobby Jindal is my governor, and I've been teasing that we should have a hashtag FBJ, forget Bobby Jindal. But the whole point of why we can't forget him is because the Democratic Party in the state of Louisiana at this point did not put up a real candidate against him. Like, you can't vote for someone else unless there's a real alternative. How do we get the politics? Like, can the National Democratic Party look at this and say, we are targeting Texas, we're targeting Louisiana, where they're turning down basic, rights?
Well, the Democratic Party should be doing that, but in the absence of that, people who are concerned need to go to voters themselves and get them to start pressuring politicians actually in both parties. We have nearly 50 million Americans who are officially poor by the federal statistics, by the federal guidelines. Another 50 million are what we call the near poor. They're just a notch or two above the official poverty line. That's almost 100 million people, which is about a third of the entire U.S. population, poor or near poor. What kind of a middle-class society is that if you have so many people who are living in poverty?
Right, it's not a middle-class society, right? It's that growing difference. And it's not, Ms. Edelman just made the claim about it being sort of a basic right and what's good for the people, but people who have health care go to work and they earn wages and they pay their bills on time. It is also good economic development.
But Melissa, those 8 governors, those 7 governors don't care about that. This is a political strategic move for them. Right. The same move that when Jan Brewer, the governor of Arizona, waved her finger in the face of our president. Yeah. This was all about sending a message to her supporters to galvanize her base. These are political moves. It's not that they are saying we don't think that this care program is good for our citizens, because they know that it is. Yeah. But it's thumbing their nose at the Supreme Court, thumbing their nose at the president, and making sure that they galvanize their Republican base.
Right, listen, they were up on the screen there. I just want to be sure, because you're right. It's a political move. They're not making a claim that it's not good. So if they're going to play politics, let's play it. These are the folks. If you are watching from one of these states, your governor, FBJ, but all the rest of them too, your governor is saying, I don't care that you're poor, I don't care that you need health care, I don't care, as Mrs. Edelman just pointed out, that it'll be free to our state initially. We're just not going to do this.
Right. And so I'm from Texas originally. 1 in 4 Texans, I know. 1 in 4 Texans is uninsured. Rick Perry has already proven that he does not care about the citizens of his state when he gave up millions in federal dollars for family planning programs and cancer screenings because he wanted to make a political point about Planned Parenthood. And in this case, we have to be really, really clear as to who they don't care about. And that is women and all folks of color, because those are the people that are going to be hurt most by these refusals. And Rick Perry is saying, I care more about my presidential ambitions, because that went so well the first time, than I do about the millions of Texans who would be helped by this.
And Rick Perry is such a good example, because he initially, you saw the sort of Rick Perry as governor making sense on the HPV vaccine decision initially, and then you saw him have to backpedal from it, turn around, twist, do a jump shot to pretend as though somehow the HPV vaccine was a bad idea because somehow it became government encroachment. You actually saw the politics impact people's health in that.
Exactly. And if the Texas legislature, much like the U.S. Congress, spent as much time trying to eliminate poverty as they do trying to make sure women can't get abortions, then there would be no poverty in Texas. But one thing that people never point out is that Texans who do pay for their own insurance, who are insured, pay almost 80% more than some people in other states because they are covering the uninsured. This expansion would help that. It would actually alleviate a burden for folks who are already buying their own health insurance.
Can I just reinforce that? The taxpayers of Texas are the ones who are going to pay this. The economy in Texas is going to lose because they're going to turn down billions and billions and billions in federal dollars that they need and spend billions in uncompensated care for people who show up at the emergency room, who have low birth weight babies that are going to cost a fortune, that, they're dealing with. It's the taxpayers and the citizens of Texas and their economy. And we're able to get the business community to join us in trying to get Texas to enforce the Children's Health Program because it was money. They were turning down billions of federal dollars.
The middle class is hurt, even if they're not covered by this Medicaid expansion, for example. They are going to pay for all these folks, and they're going to be paying for folks who are getting medical care much too late.
Exactly, which costs even more. And that's why it's so obvious that Mitt Romney's medical program that he had in Massachusetts was the same thing as what's going on here. But he can't admit to that because he has to play to the far right, and so he's making all these politically expedient moves, even though they are against the middle class and they are against the very people that would benefit from these programs.
I mean, this argument of the individual mandate, the reason that Republicans like Mitt Romney put it into place was their sense that this was about individual responsibility, because otherwise it falls on taxpayers. Like, that used to be the line. Now the line is, what did President Obama do? We are for the opposite.
Exactly.
Right? I mean,
logic goes out the window, and political expediency is what determines determines the debate.
But it feels even more than like just political expediency. I mean, I'm thinking about the fact that you're the first African-American woman admitted to the bar in Mississippi. And you know, the story of Mississippi is standing in the schoolhouse door, right? The story of Mississippi is that story of massive resistance, which in certain parts was about political expediency, but felt like it was about something more than that. It wasn't just about winning the next election. It was also about this sense of you people do not get to be part of the American story.
Well, that is right. And what I think we have on here is a resurgence of the old bad stuff. We're resegregating in many ways. We see hate crimes going up. We see racial profiling and racial violence going up. I think some of us think that the black community and the black child in this country is facing one of the worst crises in terms of backwards mobility or backwards actions on race relations. I think we're in the midst of a second post-Reconstruction era. And if you look at what's been happening to our schools, you look at mass incarceration, the cradle-to-prison pipeline, if you look at the job market, if you look at the non-enforcement of very basic rights, you look at voter suppression, this is a very dangerous time, and there's some underlying racism here that we need to deal with.
And we are going to, in fact, look at exactly those issues of the cradle-to-prison pipeline and of unemployment as we go on in the show. But some of you may be asking, why should I care about prisoners? Do the crime, do the time. I mean, with all the problems facing our country, why take time to think about folks who are locked up and locked away? For starters, most prisoners will eventually return to communities. The conditions they face in jail make a big difference in their lives when they come home. And this is true in particular for one group: young people. The United States locks up vastly more of our children than other developed nations. The kinds of young people most likely to feel the wrath of the prison system compared to white youth. Young Hispanics are 43% more likely to be waved into the adult justice system. And from the ages of 10 to 17, black kids are more than 5 times as likely as white kids to be arrested for a violent crime. Now remember, these are children that we're talking about, not hardened criminals, and many of them are victims themselves of economic and social factors that are out of their control, factors that could be fixed if the adults in the room were paying more attention. At the table are Marian Wright Edelman, president and founder of the Children's Defense Fund, Bob Herbert, senior fellow at Demos, Reverend Vivian Nixon, the executive director of the College and Community Fellowship, and Glenn Martin, vice president of public affairs at the Fortune Society. Thank you all for being here. Glenn, I want to start with you. Tell me what the school-to-prison pipeline is.
Sure. Essentially, we've put our children, unfortunately, on a pipeline from education right into the criminal justice system, mostly young men of color, young black and Latino men, but increasingly young black and Latino women. And essentially what we're doing is, instead of spending time investing in educating our youth, we are criminalizing behavior that just 10, 15 years ago was not criminalized. And the response to it is no longer a trip to the principal's office, it's a trip to the local police precinct. And once you're enmeshed in the criminal justice system, extremely hard to extricate yourself from that.
Yeah, I want to pause there and not miss that, because I think folks sometimes miss that particular point, that the crimes that people are currently being incarcerated for were not crimes a very short time ago. Because I think it's real easy when we start talking about prisons and incarceration or even juvenile incarceration, we say, well, I mean, you're a criminal. You broke the law. But we have to remember the laws actually move around. We decide what is legal and illegal. I mean, it was illegal to be black sitting at public lunch counters at one point in this country, right? So what are the alternatives to incarceration? If we're talking, for example, school infractions, what are the alternatives to this kind of criminalizing of young people, Reverend Nixon?
We need to be dealing with children as though they are just that, children. And there are families involved when you're talking about children. So generational approaches need to be happening. We need to be addressing the problems in families that are causing children to act out in ways that are now criminal, because you have police in schools and you have children who are going to act out because it's a natural part of the growing up process. Right. And it escalates over time as it gets unaddressed. And it's unaddressed because families are not being addressed in our communities. Resources are scarce in the community. Parents are stressed, having to work 2 and 3 jobs just to survive in this economy. And therefore, raising children becomes more and more difficult as time goes on, and there aren't supports to give parents what they need in order to address these minor infractions before things become out of control.
And this seems so important to me that it's, sometimes we say, well, it's the families, and so somehow it becomes beat your kids and yell at your kids. But this notion that, well, look, when we have food insecurity, kids come to school hungry. When people are losing their housing, they end up doubling and tripling up in households. That creates stressors. I was just shocked to see that school acts of like violence and acting out occur at the end of the month because food stamps have run out and kids are actually hungry. No one has done more on this question of like the broad structures that our kids are facing. How do we keep kids out of that school to prison pipeline?
Well, I'll go back to the cradle to prison pipeline, but let's talk about schools. And I think that the zero tolerance school discipline policies have got to be changed. The majority of children who are being suspended or expelled from school are committing non-violent offenses. Truancy and tardiness. What sense does it make to put a child out of school because they're not coming to school? We need to have them in school. And 80% of our children are not learning in school and are not getting what they need, don't have high expectations, are not respected. Surely they're going to act out. If they don't have health care, they're going to have attention deficit disorders or high things that are not detected, so we've got to make sure that they have what they need in order to learn. But we are criminalizing 5-, 6-, 7-year-olds. I mean, don't tell me that adults in a school setting cannot figure out if a 6- or 7-year-old is having a temper tantrum, how to solve that in a school and not call in 3 police to handcuff them. And we're silent about that. We have got to stop this, and we've got to have common sense.
I went to Florida on a case and wrote about it where a 6-year-old girl who was in kindergarten was arrested, put in handcuffs, and put in the back of a police car because she had a tantrum in kindergarten. The handcuffs,
and 4 Mom could get to school.
The handcuffs were too small, too large to fit around her wrist. They had to put the handcuffs up around her biceps. This is really sick behavior.
But for me, a bigger problem is the fact that when that went out across the airways, when people saw pictures of that, there was not the outrage that we saw back in the civil rights movement when we saw people getting hosed down. Why isn't the same outrage present in our community?
That is the question.
I'm glad you brought up the civil rights movement because what you said earlier was important, which is that we haven't been locking people up at this rate forever, right? We see the end of the civil rights era. We see this huge spike in incarceration. If you extrapolate, you recognize that it's mostly young black and brown men and children. But to go a bit further, we're also attaching invisible punishment to those convictions. So we're setting kids up for failure through collateral consequences. If you have a conviction, you can't go to school here. If you have a conviction, you can't vote here. If you have a conviction, you can't get a license here. And so in many ways, the system has this inherent hypocrisy where we tell people, once you come out, do the right thing, get your life back together. But wait a minute, you can't go to school here.
Right, this is the recidivism story, right? If you have a felony, you can't live in public housing. You can't get a student loan, a federal student loan. There's tons of jobs in many states that you simply can't, for example, be a barber in some states. And so you can't get a job, you can't go get an education, and you have nowhere to live. Of course people recidivate. Of course they go back into the system.
And in this society where we're trying children as adults, imagine being a child, 16 years old, getting convicted of a crime in adult court in a state where, because you were convicted, you can never vote in your entire life. The community is saying, we don't want you, you're not part of us, you're not part of this society.
Can we just clarify that the majority of children who are put out of school for non-violent offenses? Millions, we've got 7.1 million folk who've been in prison or under control of the criminal justice system. Many of them are there for non-violent offenses. We have racial disparities and income disparities and who gets charged and who goes to prison and what their terms are. So this is an unjust system, and that's what we've got to deal with.
And we're going to talk more about that, and specifically also on this question of an unjust system that picks up certain kinds of kids and then keeps them from ever being full citizens. If you think politics and prisons don't affect each other, this might change your mind. A new study by the Sentencing Project reminds us why every vote counts and why so many votes just won't even be cast. 5.9 million Americans are forbidden to vote because they live in states with laws that disenfranchise convicted felons. It's one of the key reasons why in battleground states like Florida and Virginia, 1 in 5 African Americans simply can't vote. So in the case of voting, politics in prisons do go hand in hand, and the important distinction is who benefits when the two mix. At the table are Marian Wright Edelman, Bob Herbert, Reverend Vivian Nixon, and Glenn Martin. Glenn, I want to come to you on this because you're an ex-offender. You do the work of your organization, but this is also a lived experience for you. What does it mean, this notion of being disenfranchised because of a crime?
Sure. At the Fortune Society where I work, we have thousands of people coming through the door who've been involved in the criminal justice system. I happen to live in a state where you actually get your voting rights back at a certain point. My own experience is that when I got off parole and I tried to register to vote, the local boards of elections told me I couldn't and that I wasn't eligible to vote, even though the law in New York State said quite the opposite, recognizing that it differs from state to state. So that was my introduction to this issue. When you think about recidivism and how do you keep people out of prison, you could find no better recipe for getting people to reoffend and to make them feel as though they're not part of the social fabric. And a great way to do that is to take away their right to vote. And then when I talk to individuals about their right to vote, some of them say, well, my vote doesn't count anyhow, right? I mean, even average voters are very disenfranchised here in New York State and very disillusioned with the voting process. But what I say to them is, if it's not important, why do they take it away? Right. And then they stop to really give it a whole bunch of thought. In my opinion, I'm not even sure why we take away people's right to vote at all. You know, you don't take away their citizenship when they're convicted. So we knock people down a notch and take away all of these other rights. Unfortunately, we don't have a ceremony to bring people back up once they're released and help them recognize that they're once again part of society.
Yeah, Michelle Alexander calls this the new Jim Crow, not just because of all of these black bodies and brown bodies that are incarcerated, but also because, like Jim Crow, it creates second-class citizens, people who simply are disenfranchised.
Well, some of us think that this is a major way not only of political disempowerment, because it's always been about power and the vote, and so you disenfranchise, you take away the vote, but it's also a route to economic disempowerment, because many of them who go into prison cannot get a job, cannot get public benefits, cannot find public housing, and so this is a major, major way of undermining the strength and power and vibrancy of communities of color and of poor communities of color, and it is the new Jim Crow or the new apartheid or the new slavery, however you want to do it, but we've got to break it up.
While still creating economic incentives for the prisons themselves. I mean, when we were talking about that 8'2" bird, big bird in the first hour, and we were talking about this notion of privatizing Sesame Street. Well, the prisons have been privatized, right? There are people who are getting economic benefit from incarcerating our children and folks in our community.
People make money off of this big time, so that's obviously a big issue. But we should not lose sight of the fact that the Republican Party benefits directly from this because they're disenfranchising people that would vote overwhelmingly Democratic, and
1 in 5 black voters in Virginia and Florida.
From the beginning, exactly.
Right, that's the election.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, 1 in 5 black voters. We know the vast majority of those votes would go to President Obama if they were able to be cast.
I've worked on many legislative issues around opening up opportunities for people who've been involved in the criminal justice system. I'll never forget introducing a bill and sitting with a senator and saying to him, here's a bill, Republican, conservative, in a district with 9 prisons, and he took a look at the bill and he was like, this is great, but these are not my people. I've never had that response on legislative advocacy ever, but he was crystal clear with me. These are just not my folks, meaning these are not Republican votes. Good luck.
Right.
And I don't want to lose the privatization issue because it's a very big issue. The Corrections Corporation of America and GEO are really making bids to really lock up more and more people, and people of color, males of color, and immigrants are the core population. The Corrections Corporation of America has just sent a letter to 48 state governors offering to run their prison systems for 20 years if they could be guaranteed a 90% occupancy rate. Our states are spending...
I want to pause. I don't want anybody to miss that. They can be guaranteed a 90% occupancy rate.
I mean, we've got to see what is going on here, and this is part of a bigger privatization movement. Not just Big Bird, but it's, people want to privatize Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. So this is a bigger ideological fight about undermining the role of government. But we really got to look at the privatization problem, and the states need to wake up too, because the cost of incarcerating more and more people, they're spending on average 2.5 times more per prisoner than per public school pupil. That's the dumbest investment policy I can think of, particularly since we have huge recidivism rates.
And I want to give you the last word on this. If that is a bad way to spend our money, what are the alternatives to incarceration, particularly for young people?
Well, it's a huge, huge problem, and there's no way we can't spend our way out of it because it's an ideological issue, as Ms. Edelman said. But where we're going to spend our money does matter.
Yeah.
We need to be investing in opportunities for people to have employment, at least to sustainable and living wages. We need to make sure that when people are released from prison, because we do have 2 million people in prisons, we have to wonder what's going to happen to them, that there are not laws in place that bar them from jobs, bar them from school, bar them from housing, because that is a recipe for disaster. We need to be investing in strategies that address not only the adults who are incarcerated, but the children who are incarcerated and the children of the adults who are incarcerated, because this is a multi-generational problem.
People often ask me what turned my life around. 2 things. Access to education. I was lucky enough to get a college education while I was on the inside. Second thing, hope. Someone took the time to stop and say to me, you can do better, you can do differently, you can be educated, you can change your life. And those 2 things combined, I think, are part of the recipe to help us reduce the criminal justice system and go back to where we should be, which is investing in kids.
In today's prisons, you could not get that college degree because in 1994, the federal government made it illegal for people in prisons to receive Pell Grants to go to school.
Yeah, so we have, I think this is, right where you are is where we'll leave it for today, although not leave it forever, because I think what you've done, particularly, I like how you brought us back, I think, to that moment with O'Shea and Miss Johnson, which is, it was both of those things. When I asked him, what did he have? He said, I had an opportunity to learn while incarcerated, and then I had someone, and in that case, an extraordinary person, who came in with a sense of hope and forgiveness. And maybe if we could start imagining ourselves playing that role as a society, actually thinking of these young people as valuable enough to invest in their education and to provide some hope for. So we will undoubtedly see you both back. So I thank you to both Vivian Nixon and Glenn Martin. More with Bob and Marian shortly. Things aren't a whole lot better, but they're not necessarily any worse either, unless you're African American. That's the story told by the latest job numbers that showed everyone else's unemployment holding steady while African American unemployment continues to rise. Just 2 months ago, the rate for African Americans was 13.6%. By the time last week's numbers were released for June, that number had jumped almost a percentage point to 14.4%. Compare that with 8.2% nationally, which held steady from May to June. Now, the new unemployment numbers make their rate 2 times the rate of white unemployment, which remained at 7.4%. Also unchanged was the Latino rate, which didn't budge from 11%. But those numbers are only part of the story, because they only account for people actively seeking work, not why they aren't finding it. So to understand that, we should consider this. 21.2% of African Americans were employed by the public sector between 2008 and 2010. Before and after the recession, African Americans were 30% more likely than other workers to be employed in the public sector. And since 2008, 636,000 public sector jobs have disappeared from the economy. It's a number that could soon be increased by 145,000. That's how many government workers Mitt Romney said he would cut when he vowed to, quote, send them home when he became president. You wonder why he got booed at the NAACP convention. Still with me, Marian Wright Edelman, and also back at the table, Bob Herbert, Shelby Knox, and Lawrence Otis Graham. Lawrence, is it not true that the black middle class came from government jobs, teachers, postal workers, firefighters, and when we look at what's happened, it is government jobs that are being cut. No wonder.
That's absolutely true, Melissa. And the thing about it is that the black middle class was built on those public sector jobs, unlike the white middle class, which was built on jobs working for corporate America, where they could guarantee that they could be a couple generations working for the phone company or working for IBM. We don't have a deep reservoir within the black community that's been a part of the corporate community. So that is not a part of our story or our narrative. And the other issue is, at a time when blacks could get jobs in the public sector, working for the post office, working as firefighters or police officers, we didn't necessarily have to be college educated or have to have graduate school education. Now it's a necessity. It's no longer a luxury, because when the white folks get cut from these corporate jobs, we have long before been cut from those positions.
It is the thing that is making me most nuts about the unemployment numbers, because we see private sector slowly maybe meekly, but growing. And it is the public sector that is, I mean, it just feels like, and our response to this is cut taxes so that the public sector will have even fewer resources to hire people.
Exactly. So we're throwing these folks out of work, these African-American public sector employees out of work, at a time when there is a full-blown depression in the black community.
Yeah.
Even that 14.4% jobless rate understates the figure. That's the official rate, as you pointed out. Only those folks who report that they're searching for work. But I go into these communities, and recently I was up in the Dorchester, Roxbury, Dorchester in Boston. You'll find whole neighborhoods where no one has a legitimate job. If you go to Detroit or East St. Louis or Camden or Newark, it's horrifying out there. It's a great American tragedy, and people are not paying enough attention to it.
And the structural problems in the economy, we've got to recognize that the jobs that are becoming available, even in the private sector, are low-wage jobs.
Yes.
They are not enough to sort of lift you out of poverty. And then we're just missing this enormous opportunity to respond to the needs of our children and of our working families. Imagine if we created all the jobs that we had for a universal child care system or pre-kindergarten system or kindergarten system or built the schools or had that.
Well, I mean,
so we could do public investment and save our children and save the future workforce of this country.
We keep hearing from the Republicans that the Affordable Care Act is this great government giveaway program, but it's economic stimulus. It creates jobs, right?
But actually, if you break this down even more, black women who were most hurt by the recession when it began are more likely to be in those public sector jobs. For every 10 jobs women gain in the private sector, women lose 4 public sector jobs. And even with this recovery, a lot of those jobs were service jobs, construction jobs. And in those areas, when broken down by race, you look at men are gaining jobs in those areas and women are still losing jobs in those areas. So we've got to look at who is being helped by which programs and really be very specific about making sure that we're helping those certain populations.
Well, I mean, the other greater loss that African Americans have had, and to add what Shelby was pointing out, is that these public sector jobs also provided great pensions. They provided great medical benefits. Right. So all of the various programs that came along with these great secure jobs, when those become decimated, those children of those families lose out as well, and they become a quote-unquote burden on our hospital systems, emergency rooms, things like that. So ultimately, we all lose by this because we have to pay taxes to pay for those programs.
For me, it's partly the story here of like what's happening with the war on teachers, where now we've decided that teachers, particularly unionized teachers who earn a decent pay, who have health care, who have retirement, are bad for kids. So now if you're, if you as an African American woman teacher may be getting your, cut your job, but also the public schools suffer, and so then if you are sort of middle class-ish, hanging on to the bottom rungs, you can't send your kid to a decent public school, and like it feels like compounds in these multiple ways.
It does compound, and what happens is many of the folks that we're talking about are college educated or have even higher degrees. They lose their jobs and they're out there in this terrible job market, and they start taking jobs that people with lesser degrees of education once had, and that helps push the whole thing downward. So now if you have young people who, for example, have only a high school diploma, they can't find these jobs because more and more of these jobs are being held by people with college degrees. It's a terrible situation, a cascade that we've got going right now.
And so imagine the dropouts. Imagine the child in school who's never seen anybody work, okay, and don't even see that in their future. What is their incentive to stay in school if they look at what is going on?
They feel no matter how hard they work, they're going to end up in the same places where they started.
And it begins very early. If you look at teen employment rates, the teen employment rate is about 29% across the country, or 24%, 29% for whites, and 15% for black teens. So if you begin there, where they can't find jobs as young people, and then you need higher education.
That first experience of showing up on time, of having a boss, of going to work. I mean, you didn't earn much, but you sort of learned something about what it meant to be an employee.
Right. It helped develop the work ethic. You got a little bit of spending change. You knew what it was like to get a job. Maybe you'd get a little boost in salary, and you'd feel proud. And it just started.
And you know what?
Even add it to your resume.
Yes. And I was going to say, and there are institutions providing that in our neighborhoods right now that provide you a little pocket money and the ability to show up, and that is still possible. It's just not in the legitimate market, right? Because you can learn all that selling drugs.
And they are. They're
yes.
doing it.
And that's right. Yes. And so when we come back, I'm just going to say all the things that Shelby just said, which is to say I'm going to focus a little bit on black women who are among the... When we think about the unemployed, it's often a male face that comes to mind because it's men who were hardest hit by the recession. But the recovery from that recession started 3 years ago. And since then, women have been much slower than men to bounce back. Women have gained back 24% of jobs lost during the recession compared to men's 39% gain, according to the National Women's Law Center. And at the intersection of women's slow recovery and black Americans' increasing unemployment numbers are black women who lost more jobs during the recovery than during the recession. When black men gained back jobs during the recovery, black women continue to lose them. And with black women at the head of a majority of black families with children, they aren't the only ones losing. Still with me, Marian Wright Edelman, Bob Herbert, Shelby Knox, and Lawrence Otis Graham. Okay, I think that there's no way that we can get away from this question. I'm telling you that black unemployment is up. I'm telling you it's particularly bad for African American women. Is it Barack Obama's fault? Should the black president somehow have made this not true, somehow have fixed it?
It's not Barack Obama's fault. We're in this terrible economic downturn, the worst since the Depression, and vast majority of Americans understand that he was not the cause of that. I wish that Barack Obama had done more about jobs in general, but he's not a civil rights leader. What I think is that interested citizens have not paid close enough attention to what has happened to the poorest members of our societies, the people with the least power and that sort of thing. And I think African Americans probably should have raised their voices louder than they have, and I would have liked to have seen a great deal, and still would like to see, a great deal more activism to push back against some of these things.
I'm going to push back a little bit. I'm going to push back a little bit on that. So I feel like we just talked about the idea that it was public sector jobs that were being shed. This is a president. So first of all, you said he wasn't a civil rights leader. I'm inclined to think that the Affordable Care Act may be the most important piece of civil rights legislation in, since the things that we think of as civil rights legislation, right? But even beyond that...
But not promoted as something that specifically would help African Americans. Right, it helps a lot of African Americans.
Undoubtedly, but has an enormous disproportionate impact. But the second thing, this idea of the public sector having been what shed the jobs. I mean, I live in a state where Governor Bobby Jindal turned back stimulus money, right? Where Republican governors said, you know what? No thanks. We're not going to take those government jobs. And then in places like Wisconsin and other places where they literally just started laying off government workers, mostly under Republican governors.
But we blame that on the Republicans, right?
We do, but I want to talk about who is the they when we say they are doing this. And this
the man.
The white man and some white women. But let's truly look at who are making these decisions, who are being elected. We have no black women in the Senate. We have very few black women in the Congress. The rates being elected on the state level. And so, should Barack Obama have done more? Yes. But was he going to wave a magic wand and suddenly eliminate systemic racism and sexism? No. But being in the room...
President Obama is not, in fact, magical? But he does not, in fact, have a wand? What is this that you are saying, Shelby Knox?
But being in the room is incredibly important for black women's voices to be sitting there saying, actually, we are more impacted in different ways. The policy has to be tailored in different ways every single time it's enacted.
That's so true, and this is a lot of why I think that Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, that was so much a message in her campaign of the involvement of women. When you look at in corporate America, it's not the women that get hired in the entry-level positions. It's who is sitting in the boardroom. Is it just one woman out of 12 men that are making decisions about hiring? But it's not just hiring, it's promotion, it's retention, it's making sure that there are women in line leadership positions who are actually going to bring in people after them, not be gatekeepers and say, well, I'm in, so later for the rest of you. And the same thing is true within government. When you pointed out the fact of the lack of black women in the Senate, these things all send messages when there's nobody in the room, whether it's a female producer in the room on a show, to remind them to say, no, you can't say that, or we have to make sure we have a message, or we have to make sure we we have a women's voice or a message here. That same thing is true in corporations.
Yeah, Congresswoman Barbara Lee was here last week and was pointing out this question of elections having consequences, and said, look, if Democrats retake the House, if you want to see women in leadership, you got to give Democrats back leadership and a majority in the House, because in fact there are so many more women in the Democratic Party that you'll end up with women in positions of power, including the kinds of positions that will make sort of some of these jobs programs come through.
We need more women in the room. We need more people of color in the room. We need more people who come from backgrounds that can relate to people in need. We need more people who are not scared of saying the word poor. The president can't do it unless we make a whole lot of noise and build a movement from the outside. Politicians respond. They don't always lead and can't lead alone. I don't know how the man gets through the day. He inherited 2 wars.
I know, right?
He inherited 2 wars. He inherited a huge bad economy.
Right.
He inherited a huge budget deficit from the Bush tax cuts, and from all these top 1% that have raided the Treasury. And he inherited a toxic political climate, and he inherited, you know, and people are crazy. They have a black president. Many people are really just out of their minds. We have a black president in the White House, and they just want to bring him down.
Right, and there was this sense somehow that, like, his blackness alone would be sufficient to solve the, you know, these deeply ingrained decades of inequality.
That's why it's so important to have this movement. You have to start connecting some of the dots. Think of all the things that we've been talking about here today. We've been talking about the cradle to prison pipeline, what they're doing to kids in school, taking away educational opportunities, the diminishing middle class, lost job opportunities, voter suppression. There are so many things on such a broad front that are really hampering the lives of black families in this country. There needs to be a huge pushback. And I don't think that can come from one president of either party, black or white.
But let's say what he also has done. You talked about the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
He did a stimulus program that went 30–40% to the poor. He didn't say poor, he said middle class, but the money was out there for the poor. So that was the point. He expanded the earned income tax credit. He expanded the child tax credit. He expanded food stamps. He gave us more money in education and early childhood. And all of these are public sector efforts that were... So he's talked a bit...
He's delivered so much of his promise. And he doesn't make cheap moves leaking things like how Mitt Romney's talking about, well, maybe I'll pick, you know, Condi Rice. You know, that's a cheap attempt to say, well, okay, women, I'm listening to you, African Americans, I'm listening to you, even though neither women nor African Americans look towards Condi Rice as someone to represent their views.
And I'll say, you know, my favorite one that we don't talk about very much is the Pigford settlement, which was the money to black and Native American farmers that have been held up and held up. And that is our show for today. Thank you so much to Marian Wright Edelman, Bob Herbert, Shelby Knox, and Lawrence Otis Graham.